but then it was one day I just kind of got walked in. The director of that was my boss at the time got let go. And our VP was like, "You're leading the team now." I was like, "Okay." I think I should hear you now.
Yeah. Okay. How about now?
Yeah, we're good now.
Perfect.
How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. It's nice to finally meet you in this face-to-face sort of format. Yeah.
Somewhat, somewhat face to face, but
Somewhat
yes,
face-to-face, almost real.
it'd be so much cooler if we were in Toronto together. I'm like,
Yeah,
that would be fun.
over a front-end happy hour type beverage.
That would be delicious.
Which would be really cool. So let's hop right in because I know that you're on a really short schedule, and I mean, you're a busy guy. So, how about we start by you telling me where did your first memory of technology come from, and what sort of gave you that first spark?
Ooh, that's a good one. I like that.
Oh, thank you.
I don't know. Like, I didn't grow up with a computer. I mean, in the house, like it was later in my like teenage years that we started to actually have the family computer. But what I think of when I think of technology is trying to figure out how to put VCRs together to like edit skate videos. Like I used to skateboard a bunch, and like you would try and like you'd film this video on a VHS tape and then try to like splice it and edit. It was awful. Like I think about today, like how cool it would be growing up, being able to shoot a video on your phone and literally edit on your phone. And the stuff that I tried to do back then was so much harder.
Yeah, I remember we used to skip school to go watch Warren Miller videos for the snowboarding stuff. And so it's yeah, that whole thing of the press play in this and record on this all at the same time. So it was okay. So that's a really interesting start. So a very very hands-on craftsman style of technology as your first exposure. And you say now in your teenage years, this moves into this is when the family computer arrived. Is that
yeah?
What was that like, or what happened along those lines?
I don't think I never dove into it a lot. Like I started to figure things out. And like even internet was just not like I remember my dad being like, we don't need the internet. Like the internet's like a fad. Like he believed that forever. He might even still believe that. I hope he still
I'm not sure myself. I don't know if it's going anywhere. So
I like to think we've evolved and things like that. So
yeah.
But yeah, so like I feel like I remember being on like ICQ and stuff like that, like when I was a teenager, and like that was a thing where you were chatting and doing those types of things. But it wasn't really until like late in high school when I remember doing some of my first like coding would have been with things like Angel Fire or GeoCities. So we're talking like late 90s, early 2000, maybe around that when that happened. And I didn't really know. I was like, oh, yeah, this is kind of cool and stuff. Like, I love this. Like, I'm editing some HTML, whatever the hell that is. But that was kind of my first like dive into doing more of that. I had a really close friend that built computers, and I remember him helping me build like a computer later on. So that was kind of cool, like learning how to actually build and do that stuff. I was always into like electronics and speakers and, like anything like car electronics, like that kind of stuff. I did a ton of stuff like throughout my teenage years so I think it's always been there, but the computer wasn't the biggest driver for me until later.
That's really, really, really interesting. So, and you weren't even particularly committed to computers throughout your high school career. And maybe I imagine as a teenage boy writing a website, you're throwing up pictures of skate links and things like that. And,
yep.
if we're in the 90s, it's the flashing under construction sign. And
that was important. You started your website always with that flashing under construction. Like it was right. Like, that's how you start a website, right?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, that's line one. And then now I had a sneak peek at your start. So I imagine at this time this is about the heyday of Flash games and things too. So were you?
Yes.
Yeah.
I would say that was actually the driver of like my early career. I was building Flash like applications, Flash games, animations, you name it. Like when I even got more into professional side of things, that's what I was doing. Was like clients were hiring us to build. Like I remember building like Flash player, like for video, like literally where because we, HTML video wasn't a thing. Like, so you had to build like this Flash application with a little hint of JavaScript that talked to the browser. And then you could embed different videos. And like, I remember making this extendable video player that you could embed and, add content, like not having to edit Flash. Like that was huge. Like these are like the interesting things that you go back to where you're like, oh, a line of HTML can now get me video in the browser. But that wasn't the case back then.
No. And I mean, how funny where you ended up at a video streaming platform with this being your first early stuff. So now did you do any of that before you went to college or?
I remember picking up like copies of Photoshop and Flash. Like I remember, and this was like Macromedia Flash. This is not Adobe because that hadn't happened yet. But I remember it was like Flash 5. And I remember being like, wow, like you can create like games and animations. And I remember getting a copy of that and like trying to figure that out. I don't think I was very successful. And none of that really clued into me fully that this is like an interesting concept for me to do professionally. It was me trying to decide what I want to do after high school. I think I took a year off and like worked at like a car auto body shop and which like I love cars. So that made sense. And then I decided, I was like, well, I really like art. I'm like, I've always like as a kid drawn, I did a lot of graffiti as a kid, like all that kind of led into me thinking, well, what can I do with my art and maybe make money off of that? And so it was like, well, you could do something like graphic design, or there was this concept of like a web designer was a thing that was starting to pop up. And I was like, yeah, I think I could do that. And that's cool. And so I found a college, like 2-year program to kind of like learn that. And it was there that I got really introduced into coding. Like it was, here I thought I wanted to design, which is cool. But then it was like, I got this love for actually coding and creating and seeing things in Flash animate. And so I quickly fell in love with that concept and, I'm not a designer. I'm probably not a good designer. But coding was where I stayed and stuck with.
Coding got you. And so if I remember my early days working in Flash, there's all of that timeline stuff, but I guess, and then you listen to people who are experts in Blender and stuff, and they say, well, I'm a designer at heart, but in order to achieve the designs that I need, I had to go to programming because there's no other way to do that manually. And so you found that right away, that in order to achieve your goals, it was code, and then you didn't look back.
And I think, absolutely. And I think Flash is a good example, where I think you could have achieved some of the things manually, but it would take forever. And it was like those small tweaks, like where you're like, the timing of this animation is off. It was like a lot of work to like maneuver the timeline, especially when you have layers on layers and layers on this timeline, it becomes really difficult. But once you start abstracting like, oh, a variable that literally is like, here's the speed and I can tweak it by like 3.1 to 3.2 and that's the better speed. That's awesome. Like it's a lot more extendable. That was kind of cool. I was like, this is really the way to go. I'm sure my first Flash applications were just like a bunch of timelines and messy to follow. I mean, ActionScript 2 was it wasn't the best language, that's for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So, let's say we're at the end of your college career and you're starting to look for a professional engagement. How did you find it, and where did you go? Like, what were you looking for? And
Yeah. One nice thing was part of the college course was you did a practicum or internship, whatever, I think that time they called them practicum. And so it was a 2 month or 2 or 3 month engagement right at the end of the course. It was a requirement in order to pass was that you went and worked in the real world. I was fortunate enough to work at a company that it was a small design agency or whatever you want to call it. They were doing different work for the government, for all these different things that they were doing. And I ended up getting hired full time. So I did my internship and they were like, hey, would you like a job? And so I stuck it out with them for a bit. And that was awesome. Like just being able, I learned so much from there. That's kind of how I just got sprung into it, was literally like that practicum, which then turned into a full-time job, which was awesome.
Okay, that's fantastic. So, and of course, there's just what do you recall? And you might not, so don't feel bad if you don't. But do you recall any of these? You said you learned a lot, but what do you think you learned at that phase as a brand new in career, fresh developer? What sort of lessons are there?
I think more so than school. I think like what the school program did, I mean, it taught you things, but like I don't feel like it gave me enough depth or even understanding. Like sometimes even in school, we're talking about like, okay, we're learning some PHP. And you're like, well, but what's the benefit of this? Like, I'm not really quite sure of like the real world, like reasoning for like templating. You're like, oh, like if it's just a static HTML, like what you don't fully appreciate, or at least I didn't until I was actually applying it to the real world. And like, how does this scale and how do we make things extendable? Or you have more than one engineer working on this. So I learned a lot of that. And I would say learned a lot from peers who were more senior and seeing how they approach some of the problems and made things a lot easier for themselves. Like I learned a lot of that more practical work. And I would say early in my career too, I had to continue learning a lot. Like I found like my evenings or weekends, like I was doing a lot more side projects, fun projects to just like own that skill. I think school just kind of exposed me to the concepts, and it was more up to me to like go really, really deep and be good at this.
Yeah. And really develop the passion that's sort of, once you're driving your own learning, that changes your relationship to it. Okay. So you were there for a little while and you started thinking about going somewhere else, or someone approached you. How did you decide that it was, you had learned enough, time to go? What happened there?
It was, it was kind of a little bit of a mix. I think I'd been there about 2 years. I still was like really loving the work that I was doing, my colleagues, everything. My wife actually was accepted into a master's program in Kingston, Ontario, and we were in Winnipeg at the time. And so clearly moving was like, I got to move.
You had to go.
And so I was actually quitting my job to move. And then I was going to find work out east. But they were like, hey, do you want to stay on as a contractor or like remote? And I think it was a contractor at the time. And so I was like, sure, like, this is awesome. Like, I already know how to work with you all. This is great. So I actually did remote for about a year, maybe even a year and a half. And then after Kingston, moved to Toronto, and I'd been tired of working remote, like by yourself. This is also before like there was WeWork spaces or
Zoom.
Zoom. Like, I remember most of our stuff was over chat. I think Skype was used too, like the odd time, but it wasn't like a given that you were jumping on like a Skype call. But yeah, Zoom, Hangout, whatever, that just didn't exist. So it started to get pretty lonely.
Yeah. Okay. That's a really good point. I mean, I think a lot of people can identify with that now after the last 18 months. Was even GitHub a thing at or Git a thing at the time, or did you have a source control?
No, you just FTP that stuff, right? Like, let's, like that was when you would do like some of my Flash applications would have like folders where it was like V1 2.67. Oh, final version 2. Like, it was terrible.
Yeah.
And you would be working on projects together, but you're like, yo, I just pulled the latest. I'm going to overwrite right now. Is that cool? Like on the server, like we're all good. Yeah, no, that's how you did things. SVN wasn't even being used very much at that point. And SVN is terrible. Like, just going to put that out there. But yeah, no, your version control was literally like manually like renaming things.
Yeah. Underscore final two.
Yeah. I always love the final two, because you're like, you made the final one being like, this is final. And then it's never final.
That's right. That's right. That's cool. Okay. So you were lonely at the contractor. You were good at it, but it was, it was okay. And so where did you go next? What happened there and how did you get it?
Yeah. So yeah, I started thinking, okay, well, I'm in Toronto now. There's a lot of amazing opportunities in Toronto, and I'm enjoying my work right now. It's fine, but it was honestly like the fact of like, I'm missing working really closely with people. I'm working with them remotely, but it's not the same. And so I wanted to work more with peers on that level. At the time when I was at this, like doing this contract role, I was doing a lot, like I think I mentioned earlier, the agency I was working for had a lot of government contracts. And so they were doing a lot of government work. And so I was very familiar with that. I was getting good at things like accessibility and caring about that. And then I started applying to different roles, but there was this one with the Ontario government that I was like, oh, wow, I have a lot of this background and depth that I can do that. So I moved to doing work for the Ontario government. I don't think I lasted too long. It was about a year or so. I think it just felt like it was too much government heavy versus like the agency work that I was doing. Yes, we had a lot of government contracts, but there was a mix of work that you were doing. And so that basically started my career moving more into the agency world. Which Toronto has a ton of agencies. Like they really, really do.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, and the difference of agency work and government work goes a lot slower. And so there's probably not the same adrenaline spike for, I've launched it. It's, okay. So you, from the government work, you went to a different agency?
I did. I went to actually a large consulting firm called CGI. They were building up, and they were probably about half a year, maybe a year into this endeavor, but they were building a small interactive agency with kind of embedded, which is cool. So it was this like slowly building up, because a lot of their clients were huge for like tech networking. Like they do just like major engagements with a lot of banking, telecommunications services like Rogers, TELUS, various banks like, I don't know, TD, BMO. Sorry, I'm a little slow. I'm already forgetting my Canadian banks. But they were doing all these things. And then a lot of these banks and telecommunication services were asking for more like software, web applications, kiosks were a thing. They were wanting all these more interactive things. And so CGI was like, wow, we could probably be like gathering this business up. They're asking us for it. We don't have that. And so that made them build this like interactive agency. And so that sold me on it. Whereas like, yeah, I don't know that I'd work for this like massive, like consulting firm, like probably wouldn't have been my normal gig, but this like little embedded model was really cool. It was like, you have this big company backing a little startup in there. And that's what it kind of felt like, which was really cool. So that was my first jump after the government gig.
Okay. And how long did that last? And were there any new modalities or learnings that you had? I mean, because I would love to check in on the things. So now you're moving into an intermediate from your sort of new in career. And what are you getting as this intermediate? What skills are building there?
I learned a ton there. I feel like for many reasons, I had an amazing manager. I think that really helped. And he always pushed like all the new technologies, like was very thoughtful, like build, even though he wasn't necessarily building as much, he would build like small, like demos or applications on the side to just kind of almost entice us as a team too, which I always love that. Always kind of stuck with me there. But at this agency in particular, I had already been doing a lot of like, we moved from Flash probably many years before this. I was moved more into like HTML5 was a thing, a lot of jQuery. Yeah, it was jQuery. It wasn't even JavaScript. It was like you're writing a lot of jQuery. But then, so moving into this agency, I was exposed to a lot more frameworks too. Right. jQuery was wildly used for a lot of the applications and things that we were building, but there would be these odd, like I would just be thrown on some engagement where it's like, you need to write Dojo. I'm like, what is Dojo? Like, and so I got like, this is an old framework, or Kendo UI. Like I remember all these different
I remember
ones.
those too. Yes.
Yeah. And you were just kind of like, it was kind of cool because you were on these short engagements. It might be like 3 months, but you had to build an application in Dojo, which I've never done. So I would get thrown into these different stacks all the time, which is really cool. And then like sometimes even having to do a little bit of like .NET or Java, because like there, you just had to like, I was doing more front end, but like always kind of having to tie that back a bit. So a lot of different frameworks I used there. I remember doing a lot of Backbone. That was like kind of an early thing that was adopting. And just as I was leaving there, I remember Angular was coming out. And so I remember doing a couple of Angular 1 projects. And so that's kind of the world that we're at right now. And I felt like I learned a ton about like responsive web, like CSS, like frameworks were coming out too, like Sass and Less were a thing. Yeah. And so those were slowly getting like introduced. I remember fighting those a little bit, being like, nah, we got to write like, CSS needs to be written like by itself. But then I remember writing a project, I think it was Less at the time. And it was just like blew my mind. I was like, okay, this is the future of how we write CSS.
This is, I see the value of this. Yeah. I remember. So this is a great time then to ask about how do you evaluate new projects? Because there's a new framework or new frameworks, because there's a new framework 10
every other day, like
every other day. And how do you say, no, this one's going to move the business forward and this one is just hype? Like, what do you do to distill that?
I think, to be honest, I had the luxury at the time where we didn't really have to think so much about that. And maybe that's a bad attitude. Like I think about it now, is because you were jumping to like a client that would just be like, hey, we need this like kiosk, like literally, like I remember doing a lot of banking kiosks for some weird reason, or like mortgage calculators. And there's things like that were created. They just wanted it created. They didn't care about the tech behind it. That wasn't really a request. So sometimes they would already have something built, like I used the Dojo example, and you're just diving into it. But if it was something brand new, we could just do whatever we wanted, which was kind of cool. And so we're following these trends, like saying like, oh, there's, Backbone is getting us like a lot. Before that, it was maybe like jQuery and Knockout. That's like the data binding library. Yeah. And then it was like, oh, but Backbone gives you data binding, but that also has more of this structure. And so like, let's try Backbone for this project. And then Angular pops up. And so you're like, well, let's try that. And so I feel like we were able to kind of just jump on different things because you were delivering the end product and then you were bouncing to the next thing.
Right.
It wasn't this code base that had to live on for many, many years. And so you could test out a technology to deliver a product that was needed.
That's a really interesting point. And what I'm wondering about there is, as a small consulting agency, I can't remember the something hype curve, right? And so it's like, if your sales team gets this technology that's at the peak of the sales curve, does that close the deal faster? So the sales team comes in and says, oh, we're going to do Angular because we're so whiz bang high tech. And I'm wondering if that helps close deals by always jumping on the new framework in an agency model with a short delivery life cycle.
It probably does, like, because companies are excited. Like I remember at the time, HTML5 was a big thing. Like it was just like you were selling that. I don't know if I remember anyone caring about frameworks at the time, like the JavaScript side of things. but it definitely like HTML5, like companies they were just like, well, we need that. Like they weren't quite sure what it was at the time. Or mobile websites were a thing. Like I remember building mobile, and that was like, you would build a separate like site too. And I remember that manager that I mentioned, I remember him starting this demo to say like responsive web, like this is the future. And I remember working on this demo with him, and it was my first exposure to like understanding how a responsive website works. And it blew my mind. Like I was like, wow, like we are creating these websites that literally are completely separate. Like they're so much work goes into it to be completely different than the desktop application or website. And wow, we can just do one that scales. And so that to me was a pivotal moment. I just remember the demo and everything. I think it even had like, it was a demo for a bank, and it was really impressive.
Yeah. Okay. And so you were saying, and so let's talk about leave it. What convinced you then to leave this? I mean, now my experience in agency, I can say, is high churn in terms of hours per day. It's somebody makes a sale, you have a deadline, and you don't miss the deadline. So if scope changes, that just turns into more hours. There's no other solution. So there are some downsides to agency world, and I don't know if that's what got you, but what was it that convinced you that you were ready for the next step, and what was it?
Yeah, so you're right. There's some pros and cons on agencies. Like I love the quick turnaround, or the fact that I was being exposed to like I could work on the latest and greatest, and like you could kind of just keep doing something different. Like if you didn't really like the application you were building, you were done it, and like you're on to a new engagement, and that's cool. I felt like I learned a lot in that scenario.
Yeah.
At this particular time, I started doing a lot more like higher level. Like I was working with the clients. Like I would be like the lead developer at the time, doing more architectural, doing more hands-on with other engineers. Like it was just being more in this lead role, but wasn't given a title. I know even my managers at the time were trying to like get me that, but like bureaucracy wasn't happening. And so I believe that was a bit of my frustration, was like things weren't getting better that way, but also they were losing clients. And so I was always pretty highly billed, but some of my peers, like at an agency, if you're not billable, you don't last. Like it's just not like a company where they can try and find things to do. It's literally like if you're unbillable for a week or two, that might be unfortunately getting let go. And so I was seeing like half of my team gone. That didn't feel great. I didn't feel great that like, okay, I'm doing all this like lead work, but not really getting the pay for it. And you know, so that drove me to go look elsewhere. I ended up going to another agency, which quite a few of us left the first agency together. And that's a typical trend too in the agency world, is like you work with amazing people, you want to keep working with them, and everyone kind of moves to the next greatest thing. So I moved to a company in Toronto doing that. I didn't last long, not because I didn't like it. It was my wife and I decided to jump over to San Francisco. And it was like, it kind of happened very quickly. It wasn't something that I'd really planned on. But that got me excited about the idea of working on a product, kind of like the pros and cons of the agency world. One con on agency is that there's always opportunity to do more, right? Like you're working on an engagement or application and you're like, wow, there's like 10 things that we could do better, or like you want to see incrementally like improving things.
Right. But if you're not billable,
or the client's like doesn't want that. They're not asking, or they ran out of budget. They're like, cool, but like, this is what the project SAO called for. And that's what you do. And then you move on to the next one. I think I was getting kind of tired of, or like noticing that like there's all these opportunities that I want to like see something like continually build up and get better and better. And so that's where the product world sparked. And I started working at Evernote at the time, which was like fairly new. I think it was a couple years like in the making, and like, I was using it as a user. And so I was like, wow, this would be a cool company to work for. And so that was really exciting, because you're just like, you continually building and you're getting better and better. And like, you make mistakes and you tweak it and you learn. I love that mentality. And it's really what's kept me in the more product
space.
Yeah.
So back a step to, I mean, you said it happened quickly and you didn't really think about it. But something happened. Did somebody reach out from Evernote and say, we want you? Or like, where did that come from, and how did that? Were you scared?
It was funny enough that, my wife and I started talking about it. And I remember the time too, because like we're talking about is like, yeah, let's like plan for that. And to me, like that means like 6 months to like, to a year. For her, like once she got something stuck in her head, it was like immediate. And I said, okay, cool. We had her like sister's wedding in Hawaii. And I was like, all right, well, when we get back from Hawaii, let's start like applying to different jobs and like figure out what we want to do. So we're in Hawaii for this wedding. And she tells me, she's like, oh, hey, I got an email, or like, I think she'd applied for some jobs. She reached out first, and she got like an interview with Evernote, which is the funny thing. And she's like, it was kind of a surprise to me. Like, I didn't even know she was like already applying. And so she interviewed actually with Evernote and got the job. I was like just starting to think about interviewing, but decided to quit my job in Toronto and move with nothing, because we're, moving for her role. But I needed a break because the agency world burnt me out. So I took some time. I interviewed with quite a few companies. When she was interviewing with Evernote and getting the job, they're like, oh yeah, like who will you move out here with? And she's like, well, my spouse, he, and they're like, oh, what does he do? And she's like, oh, he's a front-end engineer. And their eyes like light up. They're like, we're hiring. And so I was like, cool. Like, I like what they're doing. That's cool. But I need some time off. And I also wanted to evaluate. And so I interviewed at quite a few places. I did interview with Evernote. My wife thought very, very highly of the company. And so I was like, all right, cool. So I did end up taking that job there. So,
okay.
Yeah. So it was interesting. It was all very fast. Like, I got some downtime. I had about a month or two where I didn't work and didn't interview. I think it was a month. I lasted a month with nothing, which was actually me creating a application, like a web application on the side. I was just like, that's how I'm going to enjoy my time. But then I quickly was like, I'm bored. I need to go start interviewing.
Do something serious and proper. Now, what was the process like? I mean, because I'm in Toronto, I don't know what it's like down in the Bay Area, but like there are so many hiring tech companies that you must have been the belle of the ball at this point, right? So was it just, what was that experience like? Was it a whirlwind? Was it high stress? How did you practice and study for it? Like,
it was different. I will say that, like, probably even different than now me being out here. At the time, I was also looking for visa sponsorship. And so that actually wasn't, not every company wanted to do that, right? Like, it does take some extra work to, luckily Canada, like Canadian citizen or sponsorship to work in the US, there's like the TN visa. It's temporary. It's really easy to get for companies. But not all the startups wanted to do that. And so I actually did hit some roadblocks where I would interview well, or we started the process and then they kind of like pull out because of the visa. So I did start noticing that a little bit, which got a little bit frustrating. Another thing that was interesting was I wasn't quite used to the like depth of interviews that they did like on the technical side. Like, this was, when I started my career, we didn't really do the whiteboarding exercises, like algorithm-based data structures. Like, you would get some technical questions, like everyone's still sussing you out to make sure that you're not completely like making up that what you're doing. But I did start to find like, wow, there's this trend of doing these like deep technical interviews. So I got better at that, like, because I was doing a few of them and I was like, oh, okay, like all right, I'm just getting tested on my skills. So that was unique at the time too, was just getting used to that. I remember, I think it was during that time that I was interviewing, even one company like made me live code in a Google Doc. And that like, I remember that being the worst feeling. Like, I don't know if I did well on it because it was like, this is a terrible way to code. Like there's just no indenting. There's, you're having someone live watch you and judge your code. It was interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that's, were the books out like Gail Lackman's Cracking the Coding interview, or was it even before we really knew what the pattern was?
I don't think those existed. It might have been around that time that they started coming out. But I feel like it was early. It was like companies were just kind of like got this thing where like, we got to do this, or at least to me, that's what it felt like. It was just in previous roles when I was in Toronto, it's not that they didn't do technical. Like I remember like doing some coding and things like that, but it felt a little more practical. This felt like a little bit more abstracted. Yeah, I felt like early on days when we were doing the technical interview, not that it's that much better now. Like I still think that there's a lot of things that we can be improving on that. But yes, it felt kind of newish. Like I don't remember there being like websites or books that are dedicated to like how to crack that Google interview and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So now you're at, you land the role at Evernote, and if I recall what I read earlier, this is where you moved from, you came in as lead and you went to engineering manager.
Yes, that was the transition.
So let's talk about that transition and just how'd it go? What happened? Yeah. What were the early lessons that you held on to? And just let's hear it.
It was an interesting time. So I did maybe about a year or half a year. I can't like timelines, especially in a startup, like that's a long time. Like there was a lot happening. But yeah, so I was on a team, acting more as like a lead. I didn't, wasn't a manager at the time. And that was great. Loved it. Like doing a ton of the, future that we were building and building a lot of features and things like that. But then it was one day I just kind of got walked in. The director that was my boss at the time got let go. And our VP was like, you're leading the team now. I was like, okay. And so I didn't really, not that I was opposed to it, but it wasn't really something that I had necessarily thought about. Like I enjoyed the fact of being a lead. It was like, I was mentoring others. I was focusing on a bit more of the bigger picture. I was still doing a ton of coding, but what did being a manager mean? I didn't really think of that too much. Got thrown into it. I'm like, cool. So now I have a couple direct reports. I have open headcount to hire. It felt like I was in a deep end. I made a ton of mistakes. Absolutely, like start of it. I didn't feel like I had a lot of direction either. It was just kind of thrown in. So I would say one thing I quickly learned or made the mistake of was we were shorthanded, right? Like, so, I'm taking on this role of manager. There's no one to replace me. We're still have headcount to hire, and there's a ton of work to be done. And instead of being better about prioritization, which I was doing a bit of, I was also jumping into the code. And that was a huge, huge mistake in so many ways. One, I was probably doing most of that in my evenings and weekends to try and make up for the fact like I'm in meetings all day now, or I'm trying to interview engineers to build up this team so that we can get out of this like hole. But I kept thinking, no, I'll jump into the code. And so I did that for a while, and it's not sustainable. It was not allowing folks on my team to learn. There's things that I knew that code base so well, and that's great, but it would have been better for me to offload and also teach someone, even if it took twice as long. It's like, we're going to scale better because of that. And so I think it was just kind of, everything was happening so quick. It was just easier to do some of that work. And I regret that. Like I definitely quickly learned like, nope, get out of the code as quick as possible. You have a different role to play as your team now. Like that's what you should be focusing on. And, if you have to prioritize things that you can't do, let your stakeholders know, like, this is what we're doing. This is how we're thinking about what's the most important thing for us to do. And we'll deliver on this. We got to put this other thing on the back burner. I'm going to be focused on hiring. Like there's just things in which I could have done, maybe instead of trying to do two jobs, just focus on one. Like it's a different role. Let me just point that out. Yeah. Everyone's always like, management's a promotion. I'm like, no, it's not. It's literally like you stepped into a different role.
Yeah. Okay. And so, I mean, unsurprisingly, perhaps there was no manager transition program. There was no training. Did you pick up books, or did anybody mentor you in how do I do this? Or
a little. Yeah. So definitely I started picking up some books, or just trying to like do a little more on my own. Similar to when I started coding, it was like I have like some snippets of some like understanding, but now I got to go deeper. So similar, did the kind of same thing, was like trying to learn. I definitely learned from some of the other leaders, but it was a startup. It just didn't have that backbone of like, yeah, here's your management training. That was something that was starting. Oddly enough, we had like our head of HR. She had joined around maybe roughly just shortly after I got thrown into management. And she came from Netflix, which is funny too. But she started building up a bit of a program for leadership in general. Yeah. So I remember some of the leaders who'd maybe been leaders for years were doing some of the training. I did some of the training. And so that started to come a little bit later. And I think that helped definitely to be a little better at that.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes me think and have a different appreciation for the professional manager. I know as an individual contributor myself, or when you sit around over beers with other ICs, you sort of you might go, oh, the MBAs, what do they know, right? And then there's the managers who are sitting around going, no, we work on this stuff and we try and know what we're doing. And so I guess it gives you a bit of a newfound appreciation for the people who come in with the MBA. They kind of know what they're on about.
Absolutely. It's like, because you're getting more of that training, right? Like, versus like, I think a lot of the mistakes we make too, as I do like managers, when I think of leading an engineering team, I think it is important to be technical. Like it's good to bring that technical depth to the role. But the unfortunate thing is sometimes we also take a strong engineer who's doing amazing, and we're like, well, the next step is for them to be a manager. And I don't think that that's the case. These are two completely different skill sets and roles. Like it doesn't necessarily, it works sometimes, but not always. And so that's why I always say it's not really like a stepping stone for people either. Is like, I think there's ways in which engineers just keep being stronger and growing as a, more impact that they're having. Moving into the leadership track absolutely is an option, but it's different. You are dealing with people. You're not dealing with code.
Okay. And so was there anything that you would particularly highlight as a really interesting lesson, or should we move into how did we transition into Netflix?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, definitely lessons learned of like learning to delegate, prioritization. Those were good, I think. Yeah. Hiring was, I interviewed other candidates throughout my career where I was like doing maybe some more like technical interviews, or, why you want to work here. Like, but I was, I'm not the one to make the final call. So I'd done that throughout my career, but actually being the one working directly with the recruiting team and, sourcing people, trying to find like candidates that you're like, yeah, because it's work too. In the Bay Area, that was also, things were booming. I mean, they still are, where engineers are in demand. So you might have the best offer for them, but there's 6 other offers they have too, which is really cool to be an engineer, being able to like, I have the choice of where I want to work. So you have to like figure out how to hire someone. And that was something I started learning and doing a bit at Evernote. And that was an interesting area that I started to focus in.
Okay. So in terms of attracting or So I think you touched on two or three things there. One is attracting the talent to bring them in and sort of making that connection so that if you present the offer, they take it. Learning how to detect whether you think this person is the right choice.
Yep.
And let's just go with two, because I have already forgotten the third, but so.
Yeah, those are big ones. I mean, one thing I started doing, I think I mean, I definitely had done this in Toronto where I started like speaking at meetups or events and conferences and things like that. Not a lot, but like was starting to kind of do some of the public speaking. I wasn't good at it, but it was definitely something that I started to get like, oh, this is kind of cool. It's challenging. And when I realized while I was at Evernote, that was something I started investing in, was like, oh, how do I like get people excited about some of the things that we're doing? You know, how are they going to know about the tech that we're using, or even just wanting to come work here? Well, that started to spring off like, well, I can go network and meet people, and that works. I can also speak at some of these events and talk about some of the things that we're doing because I found them interesting. There's a lot of interesting things we were doing. And so this kind of opened up the door for me to think about like, well, how do you get like some great message about the work that you're doing and get people excited about to come work with you and apply for your roles and things like that. So I started to do a little more of that, which I felt like that was another lesson learned.
Okay. So that's cool. So that's like the marketing angle and but not the making the decision part. So that's a really solid set of, just being out there, being personal, being approachable, and all of that. But when you're in the room, you've had your interviews. How do you know when to say this is the one?
Yeah, that one, I don't think there's any like way to learn that. There's gut feelings that you get, and I don't know how you learn that either. I mean, over time you start to learn like what to look for, or sometimes you want to also counter that too, is like, oh, I have a bias to hire this person because like, hey, they come from this school and they're great. It's like, well, is that the right thing? Am I missing out on people? And so you start to like get these little signals that help you make that informed decision. I think that naturally I've also been good about being able to read people. And I'm not saying like actually like great at reading, but just like pay attention to certain things that might be good, strong signals that this person would be great for this role, and here's why, or like here's some of the areas in which they might need to grow, but that's not a blocker. I got some like learnings in that, but I think it's just over time you get better and better at that. I don't think it's something that like read a book and like you're good. It also varies because like some roles you're looking for certain type of characteristics, and another you might be, hey, our team doesn't have this, or I don't know. It's something that I don't think you ever get perfect either. Like, but you have to rely on your gut too. You have 45 minutes sometimes, like with a person to say, like, are they right for this role? And yes, you've probably interviewed with, like, you have other people checking for things on your team too, that they're interviewing. But at the end of the day, you don't have a ton of time with this person and you're making a decision off that. So a lot of it comes down to gut. I mean, it really sometimes feels like that. I usually can talk my way through why I've made a decision. It's just not like I woke up and decided this person's great. But sometimes
you don't have a rubric or anything.
No, there's not like, well, they checked all these boxes. And I think if you rely on that, I think sometimes you miss out on some unique talent too, because you've written this rubric for a certain type of person.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we're probably ready to move on to how did Netflix happen for you? And was it a long-term goal, or was it just happened one day? Where did this come from?
It was a longer haul in some ways. Netflix had started reaching out to me to come work there. And funny enough, I remember, like, I could probably pull up some of these old emails that, like, there was two leaders that were reaching out to me. There was probably a few, but I remember the two in particular. They would check in every once in a while. I had met, I know one of them who ended up being the manager that I went to report to. He and I had met a few times at various conferences and events. And so that kind of helped. I met some of the team too. And like, met some of the engineers that work there. And like, I was like, wow, this is an amazing place to work. Like they're doing some really cool stuff. So I was excited about that. And so here they are reaching out to me and being like, yeah, we'd love for you to come work with us. And I turned them down quite a few times because not because I didn't like what they were doing. Part of it was I was happy at Evernote, but another one was I didn't want to commute to their offices. Netflix offices are not in San Francisco. They are in the South Bay near San Jose in a city called Los Gatos. And I was like, nah, that's way too far. Like, and so I just kind of kept saying that. I lived in San Francisco. I didn't want to move out of San Francisco. And I was like, that's like a good hour commute every day. I don't want to do that. And so that was usually like a big blocker. Then, I still stayed in touch, would talk with like the team and the manager, like my manager or my future manager. I was staying in touch with them too, because some of the work they were doing was very similar to what we were doing at Evernote, like moving our code base to Node and React. And this is like, we're both migrating at the same time, and they were a little bit further ahead. So it was really cool. I could learn a bit from them. And so there was kind of these conversations happening. Then it took my manager, or my future manager, he reached out to me and was like, hey, would you like to grab drinks in San Francisco? I'd love to kind of just talk to you a little bit more about Netflix. And I'm like, sure, like, why not? And he had just moved. He'd been in San Francisco for about 6 months. Previously, he was in San Jose, so very close. So he was like, let me talk to you what the commute's like. And he convinced me. I remember that night we were at a bar and, had a couple drinks there. They have their own like beef jerky that this bar makes, homemade beef jerky. It's delicious. And we're kind of walking and talking towards like the buses or trains or whatever we were taking. And I was like, I'm down to interview. And he was like, really? I'm like, yeah. And so like, I believe that was like a Thursday night. I came in and interviewed on the Tuesday the following week and signed an offer that week on Friday. Like it all happened like really, really quick, but probably like a good year or two.
It was a courtship. It was,
it took some time. And I remember just being like, and it was mostly the commute being happy at Evernote at the time. But I was like, I mean, Netflix seems great. You guys are doing some cool stuff. You convinced me there, but not doing that commute. But he convinced me the commute wasn't so bad. We have shuttles that take us to the office and back. And like, I ended up quickly liking the shuttle because I was able to get a lot of work done. There was a hard start and stop to my day. It was great. And it wasn't long. Like I was leaving the office, 4:00, not like,
right. That was what 5. I was going to ask. Did you build in your commute because somebody else is driving?
Yes.
I assume have Wi-Fi. And so if you're a 9 to 5, your travel time is counted within that. And so it's really, that's not a massive negative impact on your work-life balance or anything.
No, it really wasn't. It was, like this balance of like, also at the time, like when I first started, this is like 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Traffic was even a little better. So like, even I've noticed over time, the traffic's gotten worse, but like you could even leave Netflix at 5:00 and be home around 6, cause it was, it's about a 40 minutes without like commute without traffic. But it was fairly good. It's gotten worse over time, but most of the time now it's been a good year since I've been going to the office, but the commute is more like leave at 8:30, get there just after 9, and then leave at just after 4 and get home at just after 5. Like, so it was a good flexibility on my end. I also, I joined as a manager. So I'm in a ton of meetings all the time during the day, but those bookends of my day on the shuttle, I got a lot of follow-up emails or reading documents or responding to my team. Like there was a lot there that I was very productive. And I got in the door at home, I was done because I felt like I accomplished all the things I needed to do.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really interesting format. What were your feelings? Because I have a few friends who are sort of I mean, I'm sure you've read articles about the Great Resignation and all of the people changing jobs, but a few of my friends are sort of, right now they're talking about their their worries about their feelings of loyalty to the group around them and things. And so with Evernote, you're happy, you like everybody, you have your other friends over here. What was that like? Did you have any emotions around managing the sort of like saying goodbye or leaving a team in the middle of a delivery? Like, what went on with you there?
That was, I think it's always been tough leaving,
Yeah.
because like I feel like I've always had great teams. Like there's always one or two at least that you're like, wow, I love working with these people. And it's also like you've gotten used to that. And I mean, change is hard. Like it is. But I think that move from Evernote to Netflix was probably one of the harder ones for me, because it was like I had built up this team and they were my direct reports, and that was really, really difficult to leave, and it was sad. Like I remember being like, I'm gonna miss everyone here, and not that I didn't in previous roles, but I think when you're managing a team, it's a little more tight knit in that way.
Even.
Yeah,
I was a high school teacher, and just when you said that, it reminded me of the time that I had to tell my students, like I'm about to cry thinking about it even now, 10 years later, that, oh, I'm sorry, kid. I mean, it was a room full of 12-year-olds. And so that maybe is harder, but like, but it's, that really is because you really feel a duty of care towards these people. And, yeah. So that must have been really hard. Okay.
I remember one of the engineers, she was like, I think either it was an email or something, maybe it was like, I don't even know what we would have used messaging back there, but whatever. You have this team messaging, and she's like, let's all boycott Netflix. Like, let's cancel our Netflix subscriptions, like, because they stole Ryan.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's nice to be loved.
Yes. It's better than them being like, oh, thank goodness. Yeah. Like,
finally, Darth Vader's on his way. Let's get somebody nice. Okay. So now we're at Netflix, and, what's that like at the start? And I have some things that are more difficult questions that I want to ask in a bit. But what is your initial impact feeling like there? What is that like at the start?
It was exciting. Like one thing that I loved about Netflix, and that was actually one of my big factors for going there, was the A/B testing culture, the fact of like innovation and testing and data-driven decisions. That was a thing that I'd been talking to these teams previously, right? Like, because I'd said I've met some of the engineers at conferences and hearing about the work they were doing, and just that culture of A/B testing was a selling point for me. And that was something I was building up in Evernote. Like we weren't doing A/B testing, and that was something that I was one of the ones pushing this. And so I was learning through some of the things that Netflix they were way further along. And so that was a driver for me. I was super excited about that. And so I joined, it still exists today, but it was a new team at the time called the Acquisition UI team. And we were responsible for building all the sign-up flows for Netflix. And so everything from like your payments to your registration to your login. And we were doing that cross-platform, which was fairly unique for me. I've been doing web on, like on the phone, but like some mobile web, but I hadn't really been doing the application side professionally. And TV was a new thing. Like I've created for some of these kiosks and things like that. We'd done some larger displays, but not necessarily a sign up flow, like forms and things like that on a TV. And that was Netflix. And so that was really unique. I joined too, where they were still in the midst of this migration to Node and React. And I think that was the main crux of the code base, but it was moving away from a monolith code base. So I got to help lead that.
Right. Yeah.
To way more microservices. And we had this like, so I'm on the UI focus. And then I have this like team that I work really closely with. We basically like our sister team, they're doing the back end. And so they're overhauling their back end and like how we work with the UI, because it was all just monolith before. And so now we're breaking that apart into more microservices. And so that was a really cool area to join in. Like here, I'm getting to work really closely with some technology, lead a lot of these changes. That was really cool. Build up the team. Like it was I feel like it was maybe like 15 people like at the time. It's closer to like 50 now. So it was like really cool to like dive in and help build that team up. And like, that was where I really kicked off, like hiring became a big passion. Like I'd started to kind of build that up in what I was doing at Evernote, but then really hit hard and Netflix.
Yeah. Okay. Now, this one might be tougher, but I think you can handle it. And if you don't want to answer, just tell me to cut and nobody will even know I asked the question.
Okay.
But so in 2018, I read an article in Vanity Fair and it had the headline that says, "Working at Netflix sounds absolutely terrifying." I've read the culture document. Yep. I read all of this stuff when I started researching you for this interview. And so I read the culture document and it says you can get fired like that. Yep. And so, but here, so I speak to you on Twitter. I speak to a few other Netflix people all around. I've listened in the research to the We Are Netflix podcast. So nobody sounds terrified. And so, but these are the people who volunteer to go on podcasts, right? So,
right. That's a good point. Valid point.
Yeah. What is the operationalization of how does that play out in the day-to-day? Are people, and how does it tie into, how does it tie into performance culture, hustle culture? To what extent is that, to what extent does the warning come versus, you show up one day and you just have a cardboard box and you walk home? Because I think if we're talking about hiring, people who are talking about wanting to come to Netflix might want to have an answer about, well, this is the one thing that's publicized.
Absolutely.
Right? So what's the reality?
Yeah, no. And this is like, this is a great question. And this is absolutely not one I'm scared to answer either. Great. I've dealt with this question so many times in interviews. Like I'm hiring, right? Like I've talked with so many engineers and I'm trying to hire them. And our culture is out there, which personally, let's go back to when that night that I was at the bar with my future manager, he had sent me the link to the culture and I don't think I'd ever seen it, which is weird because it's like a fairly well-known thing. That was also 2015. So back then it was this like 150 slide deck. Like that's what it was. It was massive. So here I am on my, bus or train ride home and I'm flipping through it. And I remember texting him going like, I'm even more sold. Like I read through this and one of the things that really stuck out to me was we hire top, like I can't remember the exact verbiage, but it's basically we hire top talent and, like the people who aren't doing as well, they get let go. And the verbiage is a little harsh, but for me, it stuck out really well. It was like, cool. Like I've been in those situations where I felt like I was pulling other people's weight. And that's not for everyone I've worked with, but like there's those people, you all know that there's those people that you kind of like, I'm kind of taking on all this extra work and like, they're probably getting paid the same title, everything. And so that resonated with me. I love the idea of this like freedom and responsibility culture where you kind of get to make decisions. That all sounded great, but it was like, do I trust all this until I'm there? But I will say the fear aspect comes out. It didn't really hit me as bad. I'm like, well, if I get let go, I mean, I was still on a visa, so I should probably have worried more. But I was like, I'm pretty sure I'll hopefully do a good job. And like, if I don't, I was willing to deal with that. I do think that it's maybe misinterpreted. Right. I think like people think that, I'm going to make a mistake and I'm going to let go or get let go. I don't think that that's the case. I've let people go at Netflix. It's happened. You don't get let go for making mistakes. I have made many mistakes at Netflix and I will continue to make mistakes. It's more like you're going to have a conversation of like, if you're not meeting expectations, like your manager is going to have that conversation with you. And ultimately, especially myself as a manager, I want to work on that. Like I want to get someone to be where they need to be. Like if they're not meeting expectations, let's work on that together. And so it's a series of ongoing conversations. It's not like a performance like pip plan. Like it's not that. It's a little more informed. Like it's not like set in stone. You're not getting HR necessarily like, oh, I'm putting this person on a pip plan. But you're being clear, like this, you're not meeting expectations. Let's work on this. And together you're trying to do that. So oftentimes if it comes down to someone getting let go, it shouldn't be a surprise. Right. I mean, you never walk in one day and you're like, I'm going to get fired today, but like it just, you've kind of like worked your way to that point where things just aren't maybe meeting where they need to get, and you're having those conversations. We also are big on feedback in general. Like there's this, I always think about it, I'm like, when I say that there's, you're not meeting expectations. Like if I say that someone on my team, I'm like, that's a lot more serious than, hey, I think you could have been a little more clear in this presentation or how you adopted this technology. Like, I think we could have done a better job. That's just to feedback to help get better. But I think it's like being more critical, serious, like making sure that that feedback is very like really clear and heard. I think is super important. And it's like, let's work together on that. And so there's differences there, but you don't walk in one day, you're like, oh, like I
pushed and I brought down production for 20 minutes.
That has literally happened to people that I still work with. Like we're definitely better than many years ago where like production doesn't just fail, but it's happened where people brought down Netflix and they're still there. We make mistakes and we learn from them. It's like, if you keep making the same mistake over and over again, that's a different story. But like, we learn from our mistakes and grow. And I think that should be celebrated. And it's more about what you do with those learnings, not like, oh, you broke production, get out. Like that's not how it happens.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So now there, I guess I don't, is there anything else at Net? I have a few other like sort of canned questions that I wouldn't mind getting to, but I want to make sure that we leave enough time to get to anything that you want to say, like what really stands out maybe about your Netflix time or even beyond that. Like, do you have soapboxes? Just open mic.
Yeah. I mean, we can stick on a bit on the Netflix side too. I mean, for me, it's odd to stay at a company this long. Like, I think that's like just not a normal thing, but a lot of it, you brought up the culture keeps me there. I mean, I work with amazing colleagues, but I also love this whole idea of like making informed decisions myself. I have a lot of impact that I can make, and everyone at the company does. There's not a lot of hierarchy that you deal with. It's not political. I mean, there's always going to be little pockets of that, but for like 90% of it, I just don't deal with that. It's a lot of like, let's make informed decisions and be very thoughtful, and everyone can share their opinions and thoughts. And I love all that. Like I just feel like it's the right thing. I struggle if I had to give that up, I think. And speaking so much to this is at the start of 2021, I moved roles. I ended up deciding like, I needed a change. And that was really difficult, to your point of leaving a team. That is hard. Like I'd helped build up this team, and it was difficult to even shift to another team in Netflix. But at the time, it was kind of coming up at the end of 2020. I started interviewing internally at Netflix as well as externally. Okay. And I wanted to interview externally. I was like 90% sure I wanted to stay at Netflix, but it was like, I'm interviewing anyways. I need a change. I need some new challenges. But I also want to look externally. And so this was just to make sure that I was making the right decision. And I love even our culture. The fact is like, I mean, I'm comfortable sharing that. I talked to my manager, like, hey, I'm thinking I might want to move to a different team or just some new challenges. Like I shared that early on, and I'm like, oh yeah, I'm also interviewing externally. Here's the companies I'm talking to, and here's how I'm thinking about. Like we were having these types of conversations, which is, it's kind of cool to have that. Yeah. And then ultimately, like I found the role just like I was so excited about. I'm leading 2 teams in the productivity engineering space, and so we have a team or org that's dedicated to building tooling and infrastructure to make the rest of our engineering teams more productive. And I loved it. And I loved the my director that I was reporting to. Everything was like, I was stoked. Like, I'm like, this is the right role for me. Had a lot of the challenges I was looking for. And so, yeah, at the start of this year, I moved to a new team. And I even just like that aspect, like I could still stay with this company I'm loving, but get new challenges, which was great too.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned something about having an impact, and I know that one's in the culture document, and that ties back to the thing about you are the dreaded phrase, I imagine, you are not meeting expectations. But where's the gap in between there, in how do you record and watch for expectations? What is in that space, and how do you know what to expect from somebody? And
yeah, I think it comes down to like, there has to be trust. Like I always tell my team this too, is like, if you're, my direct report, like I want there to be trust between us, because that's super important. Like if they don't trust me or I don't trust them, like it just kind of breaks down. And I think your manager has a lot of power, right? Like the fact that they could just let you go is kind of scary. So it's, I want to build that rapport with them, is like, we're going to make that clear of when there's feedback of like, you can always get better, to like, here's something we really need to fix, and making sure that that's clear. That's something that I think it's on me to make those expectations clear, and having those conversations to make sure the other person is understanding that too. And so I think a lot of that is important, is like, you build the trust, strong communication, but there's no set expectations. So you have to have that communication. Something that I've found, even reporting to one of my managers at Netflix, like, I want to have that conversation, is like, how am I doing? Like, this is how I'm thinking about what my role is. Am I meeting expectations? Right. Like, you can ask that. There's a funny saying in Netflix too, and I believe it's been in the culture deck, but you call it the keeper test. And like, right. So I've had engineers on my team ask me, and I've totally asked my managers, but like, you're basically asking, like, do I meet your keeper test? Which is literally like, if I told you today I was going to leave to go to another company, would you fight to keep me? And if their answer is no, then you're kind of like, whoa, like that could be a problem in the future. Yeah. Or it's like, what am I not doing? That's like, maybe I'm just subpar. And like, so these questions do get asked, and like, but I think it's a good conversation starter too, is like, don't wait for your manager to say like, you're not doing well. It's like, this should be an ongoing conversation, and how can I improve, and that aspect.
Right. So as a manager's advice to their direct reports, you would be saying, during your one-on-ones, assuming you have them, ask your manager, maybe not the keeper test, because that's very Netflix culture specific, but you say, what are your expectations? What can I do to I don't know, show, to impress, or to show that I have an impact in anything? And I mean, that compares to, there's no lines of code metric. I don't know how it's done everywhere, or many other places, but it really is, there isn't an automated system for that. It's just, this is how I feel about how you're doing. This is where this is what I think your output should be, based on what I'm seeing across the rest of the team, and where I am seeing you in your career progression and your assignments. Okay. So it's just,
I think it has to be. Yeah. It's not, you need that human aspect. We're dealing with humans, right? Like, I don't believe lines of code is like, it just like rubs me the wrong way. Like, there's times when you might have no lines of code for not for years, but for like a month, where because you're like in the planning stages, and someone else on the team is committed 1,000 lines of code. That metric doesn't, you're just kind of doing different things at the time, and it's more like what you're trying to achieve. So I don't believe in any of that. And it is more, it's this human aspect, and you're right. Like it is some back and forth. But yeah, if my advice to someone is literally like asking, like, how am I doing? Am I meeting expectations? What could I be even if you are meeting expectations, what can you be doing to grow?
Next
Like,
level.
yeah, like keeping, and maybe you're just doing great and that's where you want to stay too. But like, are there things in which you could be dabbling in to grow or to get more impact and just be more valuable to the team? I think these are conversations that should always be happening in one-on-ones. Maybe not every single time, but like you want to be having these as an ongoing conversation.
Right. Okay. So there's a question then about detecting burnout, detecting just, I guess they call them sort of checkout behaviors, people detecting people when they are sort of maybe starting to think about going, and how do you watch out for that? How do you watch out for, I'll just call it retention in general and health in general, mental health, physical health, and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, let's start with the burnout one. I think that, there's signals of it, but I think too is like a lot of this we'll get back to is like asking your team, like, I think it's like building your team and building that rapport that you're almost getting people comfortable that they'll share those types of things. Like things are not going well and here's why, or like I'm struggling here, and making it a safe space can be very, very helpful. So you're working on that together. Like you don't want someone scared to tell you that they're like burning out or, like there's a reason for that. Either we're doing the wrong thing or we're not, prioritizing properly, or maybe that project is just not in their wheelhouse. I don't know, but there's ways in which, like, if it's not brought up, how do you solve for that? Yes, you can watch for things like someone struggling or whatever that is and just ask like, what's going on? But sometimes it's just literally making people feel comfortable, like being proactive to make sure that they're comfortable enough to bring that up with you, I think is so, so important. Right. So that's like on the burnout side. For people not, maybe being happy or thinking like on the retention side, a lot of people, they want to be challenged. So it's like asking them like, having the growth conversations, like, what does your career growth look like? I'm not a fan of like, what's 5 years? Like, I don't think there has to be a set number, but like constantly checking in on that. Like, are you happy with the work that you're doing? What are some things that you want to be doing differently? And so I think challenging people, finding what they want to be doing and getting a balance of what's right for the business, but also what, how does someone grow and get what they're looking for in the role. Sometimes you can even, I've had this happen where I've moved people on my team to another team because there was this need that they can fill where they're going to be great at it. They're going to grow, but they're also, that's what they're excited to be doing. And so it's kind of like even be proactive on it too. And like Netflix benefits from that. Not that I wanted the person to go, but they're happier, they're growing, they're doing this work that they wanted to do we've had that conversation. I didn't have that work for them, but there's this other opportunity. That's cool. Like, I feel like we benefit as a company for that versus like just waiting till they kind of ditch out because they weren't getting what they want. Another, one I always joked at many years ago is like, I'm hoping people, Netflix culture is great. Like people will tell you, they're like I said with my manager, I was like, I'm looking for something different. Here's how I'm thinking about it. And like, we're having open conversations and there's no retaliation. Like, it wasn't like he was going to be like, oh, Ryan, you ended up deciding to stay on the team. I'm not going to want to keep you because it's not, it doesn't feel like that ever. So that's cool. And this isn't normal, but as a manager, I think you could also look for, people not coming certain days, phoning in sick or showing up to the office.
Multiple doctor's appointments week
after
week.
The multiple,
but no cough in sight.
Yeah. Like those things are signals, but I think it's too late. It's too late at that point when you're noticing that, like, you're not going to be able to change that person too much. They're already seeking something for a reason. Totally try and keep them and like say, like, ask them, like, are they happy? But I think you need to be doing this like proactively. You don't want to wait for those signals. And I think that's important. So it really comes down to that trust. Like, you want to have a strong trust.
It's a little wild to me that 3 of the answers to my burning questions have been well, it's the feedback option in the culture document, right? Like it's just, well, we have an open feedback. And I'm like, oh, how do you worry about the Machiavellian backstabbing that? No, feedback, feedback.
Yep.
And it just answers so much. And so that's a really interesting,
and that's why I don't think there's the politics. Like I've been in companies where there is that, like you're backstabbing or like, you're trying to play the game, and it's exhausting versus like, yo, Alex, I'm not happy with your approach here. Let's talk about it. You get ahead of that. It's not this like 6 months ago, like Alex did this thing that frustrated me. And like, now I'm mad at him. It's like, no. You just literally have a conversation. It's
right then and there.
Yeah. Like it's so amazing. And you think it's going to be this, it gets easier. Like when, I mean, it's not easy all the time to give someone feedback, but like, I'll give like a VP feedback, or like, it doesn't matter. Like, it's like people are fairly receptive to it too. And like, just being able to talk through that is so amazing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that's everything that I have. Thank you so much for the time you've given to us. And do you have any pluggables that you want to shout out? There's Front End Happy Hour. You've started a YouTube channel. You've got a booming Twitter account. Is there anything else that people could find you on that you want to call out?
I mean, those are some good ones. Thank you.
Those are the big ones?
Yeah, no, those are the big ones. Thanks for having me too. It was awesome being able to you're talking about me the whole time. I'm like asking these questions.
The greatest topic ever.
Well, it's easy to answer. I'm like, this is easy. I'm like, all right.
I know this answer.
That was good. But yeah, no, I mean, Front End Happy Hour is a podcast that it's been around, I think 5 years now.
Are you at 250 odd episodes now? I think
we're not even that high. It's more like maybe like 170, 160. I should know this off the top of my head. But mainly too, because we've done like bi-weekly the whole time, which has been great. And funny enough, like the pandemic kind of threw us a wrench. Like we had never, ever recorded remotely for like the whole time. We were always in person around a table together in the same room. And so that's been unique, having to like pivot a bit. And yeah, like I'm fairly active on Twitter if people want to find me on Twitter, and I'm at Burgess D. Ryan. And yeah, the YouTube stuff, I didn't really set out to create a YouTube channel, but I started wanting to do these really, really short snippets around management of just like little pieces of, I don't know, just like advice or things. Yeah. And so I was like, I haven't really done much with video where I've been putting content out. And so I was like, all right, I'm just going to make these really short form. I started just throwing them on Twitter as the video. And I was like, but then you also don't get the like accessibility aspect where there's captions where YouTube does that. And so I have started putting them on YouTube as well.
Yeah. So even just the playlist factor is
that too.
They're all collected in one place versus going through all your other stuff. And now, do you run the Netflix engineering Twitter as well? Or is that I could edit that out if I need to.
No. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've publicly said that, but no, that's kind of goes to our culture too, is like, I just felt the need to do that and did it. Like, it's not like I had to go through hoops to do that. It was just literally like, I'm doing this, and, bring people along that journey of my thoughts around why it's beneficial and why we should invest in it. But also use good judgment, right? Like I'm not getting checked what I can post or anything. I'm just trying to use good judgment. So when I was in my old role, there was the Netflix, we had a Netflix UIE account, so UI engineering, and I ran that one. And I realized I'm like, there's not like a broad engineering one. Like it feels like super niche that we're just doing this. And it was building up a huge following, but it was like, we need one for all of the Netflix engineering. And there's all these like little smaller accounts. So I just created it like about a year. It's probably been about a year that I've had that one going. I think it was at the start of 2021 when I really just was like, all right, we're doing this, and started doing it. So yeah, I do run that one. I've even done events like at Netflix too, where like I was hosting these things back when we were able in person. It was called like JavaScript Talks, where I was just like having people speak from Netflix, organizing that, and like inviting people. Like I love, like, you can kind of just do these things, and you don't really have like red tape to go through, which I love.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's really cool. And again, thank you so much for coming along. I've really enjoyed this. And in terms of timeline, probably 2 to 3 weeks. I want to do a editing job to sort of. I probably won't cut down our ums and stuff. I used to do that, and it winds up.
Oh, it's so hard to.
It's a lot of work, and so I think maybe the podcast called LGTM Ship It. So maybe I just ship it, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. So maybe it'll be sooner than 2 weeks, but
that's awesome.
Yeah.
I'm excited. Oh, thank you so much for having me. And thank you for being flexible on it too.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I know
it
took some time.
4 months, maybe.
Is it really? Yeah, it was, because I think you were catching me right as I was about to go on parental leave. And I was like, I don't know what my kids, it's hard to like block time off on like have a set schedule then. But coming back from parental leave, I'm like, well, I at least know my schedule during the day is fairly set. So that's good.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you so very much. And we'll see you on Twitter.
Yeah. Catch you later. Thanks so much.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Yeah.